All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching this. This is our presentation for CSCE 462 at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln for fall 2021. This is our presentation on DDoS attacks and simulated using Cisco Packet Tracer. I'm Tate Anderson, and I'm joined by Brandon Ramos. So just an overview of what we're going to be talking about and showing today. We'll go over an introduction of DDoS and what it is and how we'll be looking at that today. We will also be talking about the papers that we reviewed for this project, the two for each of us, and the content of those papers. And then we'll be going over the simulation methods we used to examine a DDoS attack. We'll be looking at the results of that simulation. Finally, we'll conclude talking about the simulation and about, again, tying it back to the papers that we reviewed, and we will have our references. So just a little introduction. Distributed denial of service attacks, or DDoS attacks, is a common method used today by attackers to cripple a targeted network. So again, it's a very, very common attack that's becoming more and more used in today's world of networks. And the primary goal of this method is to use multiple compromised host machines, which is where the distributed word comes from. A regular attack would just be denial of service. But if we're talking about multiple hosts, we call it distributed. And these distributed hosts are used to overwhelm the targeted network with requests so that it is unable to serve other machines. So that's the gist of what a DDoS attack is and what it does. So in this project, we researched DDoS attacks by reviewing the 4 research papers on different aspects of DDoS attacks, answering different questions about the attacks and what they do, the ways they are carried out. And then we also simulated a DDoS attack by building a simple network in the Cisco Packet Tracer software, building a network in there and simulating that kind of attack. We will also be presenting our methods and sharing the results of the simulation, as well as discussing different DDoS scenarios and things that can happen in an attack. So to first go over the first 2 papers we looked at, the first one that I researched was titled DDoS Tools, Classification, Analysis, and Comparison. And in this paper, the authors a DDoS attack, as well as modern detection and prevention methods that are used and have been employed to combat these attacks. Mainly, this paper looks at 2 types of attacks. Those are direct attacks and reflector attacks. And we'll get into those a little more in the conclusion and how those relate to our simulation. But in short, a direct attack is when the attacker sends multiple packets directly to the victim, hoping to overwhelm them. Whereas a reflector attack has basically a middleman, usually a router somewhere in there, so that the victim cannot see the attacker's identity, and it uses spoofing to carry out the attack. So that's just another type of attack that is used to protect the attacker's identity, basically. And then the second paper that we looked at was optimal specifications for protective framework against HTTP-based DOS and DDoS attacks. And in this paper, the authors attempt to identify the shortfalls of modern protection against DDoS attacks. And the authors investigate different types of DDoS attacks and provide thoughts on the optimal specifications for a protective framework. So due to the nature of DDoS attacks and their widespread use and their different approaches that attackers use to carry out these attacks, there is not a catch-all solution to defend against these attacks. So there are lots of different options out there for defending. And so in this paper, the author goes through different types of attacks and different ways to defend against those attacks, and formulates an idea of what the ideal solution would look like to defend against attacks such as that.
All right, so The other paper that we looked over where is a congestion or a DDoS attack. And then this paper basically talks about a new type of DDoS attack, which is actually referred to as a quiet attack, which we'll talk about here in a second. But basically, the attack relies on using only TCP traffic and exploits modern network feedback control. And usually when a single source of attack is easy to detect, however, with a DDoS attack, there are multiple handler devices, which handlers and zombies are what we refer to, which are the middleman between an attacker and the victim. They're mostly end devices that are talking to the attacker, and then they send TCP traffic to bog down the network. But even then, finding the attacker is the issue, especially when they spoof their IP addresses. And how this works is that an attacker will establish a connection on the network using the end device and their control. And like I said before, these are also referred as zombies. So these end devices are used to, again, send useless packets across the network in order to disrupt and congest the network. And once enough devices are connected to the network and send multiple packets, the attacker can prevent legitimate packets to access the resource from the servers and build buffer space. The way that the reason why it's referred to as a quiet attack is because since it's a distributed TCP traffic attack, and the packets only request under a certain amount of data from the servers, a lot of times the servers can't detect that it's an attack versus congestion, which is the next paper that I'll be talking about here, which is called Detecting the Techniques of DDoS Attacks. And then what this is about is that modern DDoS detection methods and how they are used to detect and minimize the intended effects of the attack. So again, with the quiet attack, they usually rely on TCP traffic and exploit modern network feedback control. But with this one here, what we're looking to use here is the security measures such as CAPTCHA, so CAPTCHA, and they request specific amount of data from the when the TCP attacks request certain amounts of data from the servers. The attacker will try to avoid websites that use CNDs, which they can route packets on the edges of the internet service providers. And the quiet attack execution phase, which is included in this paper, will allow them to request large amounts of data from the web server. The attacker requests instead small amounts of data, but accesses large amounts of data from the websites using, again, those multiple end devices that are the middleman. So what I'm going to be going into now is the simulation method using Cisco Packet Tracer. For this here, we'll go into the actual simulation software, and I'll talk about the size of the packet, the interval, and the delay of the packets for the victim, and then the three handlers we have on the bottom here. And what this simulation is going to show us is basically measuring the round trip time from sending the packet from the victim and the packet coming back from the server. On the bottom here, we have just the logical view of the network, and then what we should be seeing with the simulation on the right. So give me 1 second. Okay, so here we have Cisco Packet Tracer, with 4 different complex PDUs. And what we can see here is that 3 of them are currently, let's see here, I can put this down. There we go. So these 3 in progress packets are currently being sent by the 3 different handlers, which we are assuming that the attacker has already sent out some sort of ping to these handlers to send out a packet to the server. So once we start the simulation, we should start seeing requests from these handlers to the server and the server responding back. In the simulation, we wanted to look at 2 different things. Again, we wanted to look at, let's see here, the size of the packet, the interval, and the delay. So for each one of these PDUs, we always set the size to 500. For the interval, for the 3 different handlers, we set, let's see here, we set our periodic simulation, and underneath the simulation settings, we set the periodic interval to about 1 millisecond. So each time the simulation goes through a process of sending over a packet from one node to another, it should constantly be sending out packets. However, for the victim, we only wanted to send 1 packet, and that means we can either send it at the start of the simulation or at a delayed amount of time. So I will start it now with having the so this is where there is no delay, and there are 3 different handlers, and I'll let it play through. So as we can see here on the right side in time in seconds, we're currently at 3 milliseconds. The handlers are constantly sending out illegitimate packets. And then if I speed it up to around 10 milliseconds, let's see here. I'm going to pause this real quick. Okay, so let's see. All right, so currently the victim's packet is in the simulation and we'll be starting at the start of the simulation, so 0 seconds delay. And when I run this, we can see that all packets are sent to the switch here, and the switch has enough buffer space, so it's able to accept all packets. You can see right there, our victim's packet is being sent while the handlers are still sending packets to the server. I'll speed this up a little bit. And then we can see our victim's packet is sent at 11 milliseconds. Now, instead of having the packet being sent out at 0 seconds delay, we will have the victim's packet be sent out 10 milliseconds after the start of the simulation. So we'll go again, go towards 9. And we can see here, our victim will be sending out its packet now. And it's currently at the switch's buffer, awaiting to be sent out to the router. Which, for how many packets are being sent out by the handlers, we can now see that there are packets being dropped at the switch, and our victim's packet has not has yet to be sent out to the server from switch 0. I'm just speeding up the process. As you can see there, we have our victim's packet being sent out. Is acknowledged by the server, is sent back. And then finally, at 38 milliseconds, we see that our victim's packet is sent back to its end device. So with the time without any delay, we can see that with 3 different handlers, we have about a 11 millisecond delay, whereas with the 10 millisecond, sorry, let me repeat that. With the 3 handlers we have on the bottom, with a 10 millisecond delay, we can see that the round trip time for our victim's packet is about 28 milliseconds, not including that initial 10 millisecond delay. Whereas without the 10 millisecond delay and immediately sending out that packet at the start of simulation, we see that there is a round trip time of 11 milliseconds. So I will here. All right, so for the results, after the simulation trials and looking at the packets being transferred from one device to another, we now look at the times for that the packet took to make its way from the origin end device all the way from the server and back. For all the tests conducted, they are displayed in table below, which has the number of handlers versus the delayed amount, which is either 0 or 10 milliseconds. Let's see here. So we can see the number of handlers and delays for the victim's packet sent out. Observing the initial control test, we can see that the 8 milliseconds RTT. This is expected due to the conditions of the simulation. So going back to our topology of the network, we can see from the victim's PC all the way to the server, we have 4 different leaks. And the way that the simulation handles the transfer from one node to the other, it will typically take around 1 millisecond. So without any delay and using only 3 handlers, we can see that there is actually using no handlers, there would be a 8 millisecond delay. Now, since we had in the simulation 3 handlers, we see in our table here, we have an 11 millisecond delay. So each time we add a handler using this delay of 0 at the start of the simulation, it adds 1 millisecond to the round trip time. However, when we add a 10 millisecond delay, you can see that it increases as a function of 2n plus 10, including h minus 1, where the n is the number of links and h is the number of handlers. So in conclusion, the results were discovered through the simulation software were as expected, different from the packet sent with a delay versus at the start of the simulation. So as we saw in the trials, the number of handlers ranging from 1 to 3, there seemed to be an increase of RTT 10 milliseconds, where we saw the 10th of that when we sent the victim's packet at the start of the simulation. As in a realistic network, where packets are being sent through several switches and routers constantly, we would expect a more realistic sense of the victim's packet being sent out as a 10 millisecond delay, as we see in the simulation. So when the number of handlers increases, the DDoS attack can be seen to cause packet loss in the network. While packets bombard the server and with pings, the victim's packet has to wait in order to ping the server, which in a case where the server is overwhelmed with other packets causing dropped packets, as detecting a DDoS attack can become crucial. Attackers find workarounds to the network in order to go under the protocols in place. Quiet attacks are used by sending short-lived packets to servers, congesting the network, and utilizing thousands of web servers in order to be undetectable from the targeted router. These security questions, or CAPTCHA, CAPTCHA, can be used to help mitigate bots from congestion in the network and helping legitimate users use services. So as we continue to be on par with the attackers, it becomes harder to decipher whether the traffic is simply congestion or from like a flash crowd, which a flash crowd is just a bunch of legitimate users using a service at once, such as we can see it usually in like banking websites or shopping websites, or if it's actually an attack coming from a foreign country. And I'll hand it off to Tate to finish the conclusion.
Yeah, so just a few more points to cover to conclude. Again, what we carried out here in the simulation was a direct attack. It was not a reflector attack, as there's no reflector, which would be, as I stated previously, a router or some other device in between the agents or the zombies and the victim, which would prevent the victim from finding the agents or the source's IP address, finding their identity. The reflector would do that in a way that would spoof it so they could not find that, or that they did find it, it would take a long time for them to stop the source from continuing the attack. So again, although we did not test any kind of spoofing or any kind of attempt to find the identity of the agent or of the source, it can be seen that that could be done by placing an middleman somewhere in there to act as a reflector. And then just concluding a little bit more about the attack tools. There are lots of different attack tools that can be used. Again, our simulation was a pretty straightforward direct attack. No external tools were used to simulate that. And so those tools and methods can be used to automate the process if an attack was being carried out, which would, in that process, would create more zombies or infect more hosts to carry out that attack, or would be done in a different way, such as a different type of network attack. And then finally, just comparing high rate versus low rate attacks with those results. A high rate attack, again, is what we simulated, which is a large number of requests being sent at once and then seeing the data from that. A low rate would be another type of attack, which is harder to detect because it's the requests are fed at a rate that is undetectable by most common defense mechanisms. So again, in the future, that is something that could be tested, but was not done. But just looking at our results, using a high rate, we can see the results from that, the effect of many packets and many requests going in at once from a high rate attack. Yeah, so just in conclusion, those are some of the things we looked at, some of the takeaways from the papers that we reviewed and how those related to our simulation in Indigo Packet Tracer. And thank you for listening.